Welcome to the New Indian Express. I have with me Jitish Kallat, who's possibly one of India's finest contemporary artists, uh, who's both a philosopher, social commentator, anthropologist, thought leader, but doesn't like all these labels, likes his work to speak for it, for him, and it does. And In fact, while I was going through his marvelous career, which is over 25 years old, um, it just struck me how prophetic some of his works were to the condition that we find ourselves in currently. So I'd like to begin right away with something that he did over a decade ago, which is baggage claim. This brilliant artwork, which actually captures Mumbai on the move, and it captures really the migrant distress that we saw during COVID. And I wanted to ask him what was going through his mind at that point and how fantastically and horribly relevant it is to us now. Hi, Jitish.
Hi, Kaveri. Thank you for having me. It's such a delight to be in conversation with you, of course, long distance, and
Yes.
it'll be a while before we all meet.
Yeah.
But yeah, Baggage Claim, Kaveri, was painted now close to a decade ago. So it's
Right.
been 10 years. And, artworks have a peculiar way of shifting shape and, kind of shedding and gaining meaning over time. So really, I mean, of course, one also feels that it's often the artworks that tell you meanings as they change the
Yeah.
circumstance in which you're viewing them. I think at the core of Baggage Claim was this twinned figure,
Mm.
the figure of the self, the figure of the body, so to speak, but the body as not a singular body, uh, inhabitant of a city, not as a singular inhabitant, but essentially a carrier of the habitat.
Mm.
The citizen and city becoming a twinned kind of body, and really, of course, at this time when I look back at the work, it does feel like a peculiar shift has occurred in the way I would read the work,
Right.
of not just our bodies as being isolated as singular as was the misconception we all had
Mhm.
until a microscopic entity invisibly begins to invade all human bodies at the same time. And I think that sensation of a collective singular body, I think, of course, should drive us towards greater closeness. Of course, we see, emergent tribalism, correspondingly emerge out of the crisis. But I think it's been a real call for us to understand that this sort of skin encapsulated organism that we seem to think of ourselves to be is really not the real self.
Right.
There is this wider body that is our extended self, and I think a work such as Baggage Claim and certain earlier pieces, I mean, I have been playing back in my mind as well. So it's interesting you bring that work up in a
Quarantine
way.
days. I mean, couldn't have been more apt description. But also
Yeah, that's
thousand
again
lives,
20 years
right?
ago. Yeah.
Yeah, thousand lives. Again, the idea of our lives actually not being socially distant. I mean, we live in such close proximity to each other. And also, what struck me, Jitish, is the images in a baggage claim of the people carrying, in a way, the city on their heads. If we look closer, you find the microscopic details of the city. And in a way, it's our memories as well as our experiences of the city, which when we saw the migrants moving out, they must have carried it with them, no?
That's right. I mean, yeah, all of these pieces, they sort of come back to me, of course, you know, 1,000 people, 1,000 homes. Modus Operandi was painted now 22, 23 years ago.
Yeah,
Each of the paintings you've cited are very large. They're about 20 feet in
right.
scale. They're almost like billboard scale. And I
Yes.
think there are different focal lengths at which different things begin to emerge. You see
Mm,
them as bodies, singular four figures at a certain distance,
mm,
and you come close, and as you were pointing out, the hair begins to unfold an entire horizon line of a city
yeah.
teeming with people and stories. And I think that's essentially how I saw the world at the time that I was painting it. I never saw a figure in isolation. Um, yeah, Quarantine Day again. I mean, the title, of course, from 2002, sort of seems to play back certain things. Of course, even when I look at that painting, there's this heightened energy or force that emerges at the throat. And I really did not foresee anything of this current world while painting it. It's often a question to me whether the artwork saw anything of the future. So, you never know. I mean, the artwork is an entity unto itself. So all of the adjectives that you sort of placed in your introduction to the artist, I think are applicable to artworks. I think most artists would agree that that none of these adjectives actually stick onto the way we perceive ourselves or our work. It's often the artwork which is a provocateur. It's the artwork that is the commentator. It's the artwork that is the inquisitor, or it's the one that asks questions really of you in a way.
That's of course you being a little humble as well, but I think it's you can't divorce the artwork from the artist. And you were telling me something, Jitish, about the San Pompidou, in fact, getting in touch with you about Quarantine Day and asking you about it because it seems so relevant to them at that point when COVID had just broken out. Talk a little about that, and also the fact that we're also speaking at a time when your work is, in the public domain again. Yesterday night, the New York Gallery launched your solo viewing room exhibition. And today, Nature Mort launches your viewing room with the new circadian study drawing. So it's a great time to be talking to you as well.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's an interesting development that I think galleries have thought of, the virtual space as something that can be rethought and re-energized.
Right.
And I did not actually, till these viewing rooms happened with both these galleries, didn't realize that that is a medium unto itself. It's
Yes.
not just a web page, but something that allows you to kind of reflect in the course of the gallery's creating of the page another dimension of your work as it sort of gets externalized. So there's something that happens when the work remains on your desk, and there's something that happens when you take it to a gallery.
Hmm.
But I think this viewing room had something of that tenor in it, that there was something more you could say through that page, which is
Hmm.
a slightly animated page. And hopefully you'll log in and see it tonight as they let it go live. It's going live as we speak.
Okay.
But
Wonderful.
regarding the Pompidou, actually, they connected regarding baggage claim because
Yes.
it was exhibited at the time that
Right. So,
the crisis was unfolding, and
yeah.
precisely because of certain elements in this work that we were just speaking about,
Yeah.
the proximity of the bodies. But as you look at each body being a carrier of many bodies, and really asking this question of the boundary of a singular figure was really, I think, an element in the work that sort of articulated itself differently 10 years later from when I made it.
So we talked about the present in a way, Jitesh. Let's go back a little to the past and talk about your relationship with words. Words and images. And I think one of the most delightful examples of this was Public Notice 3. So, that is the speech of Swami Vivekananda at the Art Institute, at the Institute of Chicago, which is now the Art Institute of Chicago, and your exhibition there. Talk a little about not just that relationship between the word and image, but some of the things that you did before that as well. Public Notice 1 and Public Notice 2, which was Gandhi's speech when he broke the Salt March, and of course Nehru's tryst with destiny. This relationship that you have to these wonderful words that have been left to us as a legacy, how do you see it as being again so relevant now?
Kavi, this was sometime in the early 2000s. I mean, this is also a time when we'd seen certain fissures emerge in our own society, and there were so many questions that came out of the moments of the Gujarat riots in Bombay, and and really, to me, at that point, one of the questions I asked myself is: are there moments in the past where we might rethink, from where we might rethink this present moment. And um, with the first public notice, of course, I hadn't known that I would make any other work which would be called
Right.
public notice at the time. So the first public notice itself was really a clerical hand rewriting of Nehru's words on these surfaces of mirrors with an inflammable fluid that, as it burns, begins to walk the surface. And it's a perennially distorting
Right.
surface of through which you might, as you go close to every alphabet, find multiple reflections of the present around every charred letter, almost like a cremated word, warping the surface of this present moment. But public notice too then became almost like an image of fossils, almost like a fossilized
Hmm.
alphabet sitting like relics.
Right.
Um, uh, in fact, replaying words that were spoken before Mahatma Gandhi broke the Salt Act.
Right.
And Public Notice 3, of course, was almost a decade after the first public notice. Um, a speech delivered on 9/11, 1893,
Yeah.
at what happened to be the first Parliament of Religions. But I think what happens in that work really is a convergence of multiple elements.
Hmm.
There's, of course, the convergence of dates,
Yeah.
108 years that separate a particular event from another event, the event of the speech to the event of the attack on the WTC, and thereon an unfolding of a world where nations are less at war as ideologies and religions turning at war. And I think it was kind of somewhat premonitory that on 9/11 was actually the first parliament of religions. And the speech was delivered exactly where the work was installed. So
Yeah.
essentially, the risers of the steps
Amazing.
on which these words
Yeah.
were installed were exactly where the auditorium stood in the very edifice in 1893. So Vivekanand spoke at the very podium where we spoke when we actually opened the show. Yeah, and the
My
auditorium,
God.
of
Much
course,
of
yeah.
and the steps leading to that space are actually lit up with 70,000 light bulbs in the colors of Homeland Security. I mean, talk
That's
about
right.
the connections. It's amazing.
Yeah. In fact, it was, the at the time when this work was made, the Homeland Security, of course, wasn't the labeling was very much something that the Homeland Security put out every day.
Hmm.
That every day there'd be a color coding for the day, and for the 10 years since the color codings existed, it never went down below a general state of threat. There was
Right.
always a threat perception to high and alert and severe, and it was kind of peculiar, Kaveri, because this exhibition kept getting extended
Hmm.
and it ran for a whole year. And somewhere around three-fourths of the course down the show, the Homeland Security had withdrawn its coding system.
Hmm.
Obama repealed it. So there was this little joke in the museum that an
You,
artwork changes national policy.
but really,
But
we don't know what impact artworks have. Who
well,
knows?
this work, of course, had a deep resonance with
Yeah.
an Chicago resident in a sort of in a peculiar, tangible way, and it's really the public response that led to the extensions of the show. It's never happened ever to any other thing I've done, really,
Wonderful.
of the scale. Yeah, that's
But this also brings me to covering letter, Gandhi's letter to Hitler, which I didn't even know existed. And you say you found it in Mani Bhavan and that triggered this artwork. But again, the very personal and individual experiences that the spectator has with artwork. It's so fascinating, isn't it? Talk a little about that.
Yeah, I saw this facsimile of the letter at Mani Bhavan sometime in 2009 or 8, maybe a year after I'd made Public Notice 2. But it remained, like all of these works, the trilogy took 10 years to make, and there's 7 or 8, 10 years, I think, between covering letter and covering letter Terranum Nuncius. So
Right.
they take time to gestate. The letter over time progressively became for me something that I felt is a space that can be atomized
Yeah.
and a body can move through. Now, this is how I saw the work. I mean, it took a while before it became covering letter. I just saw it as something that would be just a space that a third body can inhabit. A letter going out from one of the most, greatest proponents of peace to the most brutal perpetrator of violence on a single parchment,
Hmm.
and that becomes something that a third body can reflect about this wide, range of human possibilities in which we might occupy a sliver in our daily life. So I
Right.
think there's at the core of it was this image of self-reflection, and as you and I were speaking some days ago,
Yeah.
that really the work has almost with every iteration of it showing in different parts of the world has found a different meaning. Really, yeah, in 2016, for instance, Trump had come to power just 2 days prior to the opening of the show by complete chance. It opened in that end of that very toxic
Yeah.
and sort of
Very divisive campaign. It was so
yeah, that's
divisive
right. Divisive campaign.
and
Yeah, that's right.
misogynistic. I mean, in so
Right.
many ways, it was all the isms that we dislike.
That's right.
And you were
Yeah.
saying that there was this woman who was weeping because she felt that this was so personal to her.
Yes. I mean, she's a very credible journalist, actually, living out
Oh,
of New York, and we were doing a long form interview, and she kept saying at different points, "I hope my husband's all right. I hope my husband's all right." And I didn't, and it went longer than we had thought. She stayed on for longer, and I didn't realize that her husband was a political journalist, equally
oh,
accomplished in his own right, and her anxiety was that he had really gone into a deep depression at the end
oh,
of that campaign,
right.
and she just wanted to get back to New York from Philadelphia, and this kind of experience was very, very peculiar for me, that this artwork, which is not timed to be at that moment,
Hmm.
a museum programming schedule intersects with an event in the outer world, and a work that you had conceived 7 years prior
Right.
has this resonance and meaning, later. So I think to me, it's often been an act of watching your artwork, shed and gain meaning in time, really,
And
already.
which brings me actually very beautifully to the next artwork that I wanted to discuss, which was the Doomsday Clock. And you were, in fact, in at the Frisk Museum when you were discussing this just a day before you came back to India. 12th March, you were there, and this Doomsday Clock, you talked about it. And you were back and you were in quarantine, and you were there for 14 days. Talk a little again about how something that you made a while earlier again became so resonant to the world as it was hurtling towards the pandemic.
Yeah, in fact, for the last several years, I've been very interested in this image of the Doomsday Clock, and I call it
Right.
an image because it's interesting that it's proposed by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and
Mm.
every year a group of Nobel laureates since 1956 have been gathering and re-announcing different states of the clock
Mm.
in terms of its setting in relationship to the states of the world
Mm.
as they find themselves every year seeing a
Right.
changed world. And as of 2018, when I was making this work covering Letter Terranum Nuncis, which is currently exhibited at the Fristat Museum, the clock was set to 2 minutes to midnight. And that became a kind of sign,
Mm.
an interesting sign, because normally we artists, unlike scientists, make propositions which are essentially symbolic, and hence they're
Yeah.
true and false at the same time. In
Right.
fact, it's in their power of being of the power in fiction is its access to truth, whereas when a scientist makes a claim, it has to be true or false. And
Exactly.
so the Doomsday Clock takes the form of a bench, a seating within the space where every image on the table within covering letter Terranum Nuncis were images which collectively were conceived as a summary of life on Earth. To be dispatched into space, it was dispatched in 1977 and are today placed on the golden records on Voyager 1 and 2 space missions, and are
Wow.
right now outside the scope of the solar system,
Right.
and are likely to go on well beyond our extinction.
Mm.
And hence, this is a message in a bottle about us way after we are gone, and to
Yeah.
an other, which is essentially an extraterrestrial, unknown other. And it's been kind of interesting to me, somehow, that this in this world where that where, the self forms its own sense of self vis-a-vis an imagined idea of the other, and there's an absence of vocabulary between two types that don't see eye to eye, whether it's political divide or religious
Absolutely.
divide. This cluster of images about us as a species on a single planet, dispatched to a distant other, became a forceful sign for me, which led to, of course, covering letter terranum nuncius and the seating, being this Doomsday Clock bench, which of course carried into several other works of mine as well, for the
I
last few
wonder,
years.
I wonder what is the message you would send out now to outer space if somebody asked you right now, what is the message? In my case, I would just say help. What would you
Well,
say, Jitish?
an effort to avert hell from happening, could happen, but doesn't seem likely. I would put a dose of optimism.
Yeah.
you know.
In fact, that is one wonderful thing about artists as well. You always work from a state of hope, and I read that somewhere. You said that as well. That you work from a state of hope and a state of optimism.
I think that's what, even when the ideas that you are considering are
Hmm.
deeply disturbing,
Yeah,
because you're not trying to address the idea at the dimension of the idea.
yeah,
You're looking elsewhere too. You're trying to extend your focal lengths, beyond the crisis at hand.
hmm.
And I think from that perspective, you see that, that the world has actually evolved because there's always more matter than antimatter. There's,
Right,
in some ways, there's this vital force that overcomes. And that's a wider evolutionary vision within which, of course, you can have uh, more than enough reason to be disappointed with the world we inhabit, but you see it overcome. You see it overcome each time. And I mean, like an image such as the idea of climate change.
yeah,
It's not changed yesterday. It's not changed day before,
right,
but it's a cluster of forces, and one has no answers to these thoughts, and it's only when you paint, sometimes, what takes uh, thousands of years to occur on planet Earth, a change of course of a river happens on the surface of a painting in 4 seconds,
yeah,
and somehow within that laboratory of the painting, you have an intuition, and you sort of hold on to that intuition. That intuition becomes another image. Yeah, so there isn't, entire optimism, but you realize that there is an overcoming at every stage in evolution in some
right.
ways.
And also your current work, Jitish, it's so very pure and fundamental. It's almost the basic sketches, sketching and, watercolor, your circadian studies. Talk a little about, how when you came back, you were so moved again by what you saw around you, which was just sort of nature in a way, in its very simplest form. And it prompted you to sort of start drawing these barks and branches. How did that happen?
I returned on 14th of March. As you were saying, I left when US was kind of announcing health emergency, and
Right.
I came into my self quarantine for 14 days in the studio across the street from my home. And every day, Kaveri, one of the daily routines or rituals would be watering plants on the terrace. And the gulmohar tree in the studio backyard was shedding. The jackfruit tree and mango trees were dropping little stems every day on the terrace. And I began completely by, accidental chance to draw some of these. And for about 10 or 12 days, I don't think I really thought much about them. I would just draw them while I would fill buckets of water and things like that. But, it began to slightly shift some ways in my head in the fortnight thereafter, where I think it became a slightly more deliberate activity after that. I would actually look forward to this 8 to 10 a.m. time on the terrace, and began drawing with these red and green lines, each line kind of registering a different location of a shadow, in relationship to the moving sun and in relationship to the stem and the paper. So it became almost like in this triangulation of a changing time, I could mark a line. And this line is something I inherit from that moment. And within seconds, the shadow has moved, the form is not the same. Um, well, I don't know really all the things that occur in the force in the moment of the drawing can actually be articulated. But I think it's really a time when I think one's intuition shift.
Mm.
The shadow, you realize as you just focused on its edge that the shadow feels so dark
Mm.
at some moment that any light in that space between the stem and the shadow is only the backscatter of the paper,
Mm.
of the sunlight from the paper. Everything else is utter darkness. It's
Mm.
entirely nocturnal. It's exactly like what it is on the other side of planet Earth at that moment,
Right.
in that same angle,
Right.
below the stem. And I think you sort of, from that stem, you have a sort of planetary experience from the circumference of the stem to the circumference of the Earth. Something becomes the same. And I think, absurd as this may sound, I think for me, predecessors to this body of work, which often happen on the terrace are, or the backyard, are these rain studies and wind studies,
Yeah.
which are essentially taking a sheet of paper into a descending rain. And, I could draw a constellation of stars with a paper like this and draw a constellation. But the other thing is to change gesture, hold the paper like this, hold it to the sky, and with the descending raindrop emerges an entire nocturnal sky.
Right.
And I think to me that's been a kind of something I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I didn't foresee circadian studies emerge the way they did, but they really came out of a routine and isolation, really. Yeah.
And in a way, I thought they hark back to the Eclipse series as well. When you talked about the shadow and the darkness that falls here, it's the same kind of pattern that you see of all the moons that you made of all those thousands of rotis.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's
it,
true. It's
and
uh,
again, when I look back to these 4 months of lockdown, the rotis image is actually one of the starkest images that strike you. If you remember that photograph of the few rotis on the railway track, which a migrant laborer left behind as he was run over by the oncoming train. It was such a stark image. There's so much that seems so resonant of where we are now. I wonder how it is in your artwork, in your career as an artist. You're actually coming back to where you were earlier. It's so cyclical.
yes, yeah, that's something that um, I have reconciled with in a way that at any given point, Kaveri, there are multiple aspects of myself that I feel get articulated at different points, and I've tried to be not disciplined about this at all, and I've allowed sometimes 7 or 10 year cycles for a certain thought to complete itself. For instance, 22,000 Sunsets was a painting I painted in 2000.
Hmm.
And it was 2011
Hmm.
that I did a work called Epilogue, which was
Right.
the 22,888 moons of my father's lifetime.
Yes.
22,000 Sunsets and Epilogue are essentially, to me, the same artwork.
Yeah, they're like
You
two
know,
bookends.
yeah, the two bookends. And I think, and in between all of these, there are works such as, there's a work called Conditions Apply, which is essentially an image of a shrinking moon
Hmm.
in the form of a shrinking meal,
Hmm.
where time, transition, transience, but also fullness and emptiness, abundance and dearth, all of these become cycles of like perennial cycles. And it took maybe 10 years before that cycle seemed to me like a portrait of my father. I mean, I won't go into the entire sort of story of how it kind of unfolded in my mind, and then became Epilogue a year later. Um, yeah, so I think I've resigned to the time that artworks take to articulate themselves. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't, I've become patient over time.
Yeah, you're not in a hurry. There's no auction that's waiting, or even if it's waiting, you let it be, or there's no gallerist who's waiting to see your latest work. I mean, there are those pressures that artists have as well. I mean, don't they? So how do you handle
I
that?
think, yeah, like I think, what I mean by no, not by letting artworks take their time is also, I, I am an artist who works all the time. I kind of enjoy the fact that I think there is a changing self and there's a changing world.
Yeah.
And you kind of, if you're observing the world,
Mm.
it's almost like, trying to hold a pen in a moving train. As long as the
Right.
train's static, the pen's static. As long as the train's moving, it will move. It's like our self can become like a little seismograph to read the world
The
through an
work.
artwork. And I
Yeah.
think as artists, it is a responsibility to kind of, to think through and return to those inquiries and see if they can materialize. So to that extent, I pursue an idea. I pursue where things have to go. But what I would like more and more is to meet an artwork halfway,
Mm.
that these works are all in their own orbits and their own cycles, and they're all gathering from each other. And I think in that peculiar cosmography of one's own artwork, one doesn't want to tinker too much, and one wants those elements to self-organize. And then, of course, you bring your disciplines to bear, and you bring scale and measurement and material understanding and all of that. Of course, you do, but preferably only halfway. Anything more, it doesn't work really.
And the same happens with the viewer, because he or she is also bringing his own journey, his own experiences, her own memories when they view your artwork. So that is again another journey. uh, and that can be sometimes, again, as we discussed, can be very moving, like that. Walking through your covering letter, a lot of people could see the mist as a, a memory of the gas chamber, for instance. So it could
That's
remind
right.
them of the Holocaust, or
Yes.
it just depends on where you are at that point. That's the beauty of great art, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, and I've often had these conversations with, historian friends, and it it's fairly obvious that suddenly when you're there, it should, perhaps with the recall of the Holocaust, somehow those images may come.
Yeah.
But yet, it's not until the work gets made that, to me, that experience happens, because something like a covering letter is very, very nebulous in your own mind till the work happens. And the moment the work is birthed, in it, these other images begin to sort of emerge. And it's somehow, it's the artwork that reveals something that should have been in plain sight in conception, that only occurs when the artwork materializes. And you only see it in a kind of retro view of your own work. Yeah.
And which brings us really to our last point, which is about the artist as philosopher, artist as social commentator, anthropologist. And I love your word, the seismograph. You're really like a walking, talking, painting seismograph. So, how do you see your role, the role of an artist, especially in an increasingly divisive, polarized, and increasingly toxic world? We all seem to be at war with each other, and even the pandemic hasn't seemed to cure us of our hatred.
Yeah, I mean, all of the adjectives you used are heavy, so I would not carry them.
We will
But
we will ensure that that is a burden we place on you. But
but
really,
but maybe, but like but if I had to pick one, I just got reminded of a term that came up at the end of this talk that you and I were speaking about, because
yeah,
it just got Fritz just put it out.
yeah,
But at the end of that talk, somebody was asking me about my interest in cosmology
yeah,
and the skies, and and as I was saying that, I don't own a telescope. It's not skies for the sake of skies, or cosmology for the stars, but essentially to understand what life on Earth feels like if we can think of it alongside larger focal lengths. And then I actually facetiously told this person who was asking the question that, perhaps, not like an astronaut, but like a semionaut,
ah,
not
that's right.
journeying through stars and galaxies or between planets, but essentially as moving through signs, making sense of the world. And I think that would be interesting. I think a place to be. You just really asking questions and trying to find signs in a very, very progressively more complex world. That would make sense if you look at the sign to look at the sign as a pointer, really.
Jitish, if you were to make public notice for, what would the words be currently? Who would be your muse in a way? Who would be your speech writer, speech giver? What would it be at this moment in history, at this moment in time? What would you
You
be
know,
inspired by?
when on 12th of March, at the end of that conversation, the next person who asked me a question actually asked me this,
Oh,
that,
really?
and I said that I don't see a public notice for at that moment. I mean, I don't know when that might occur. There are many, many utterances that I've thought about for close to 15 years. But Kaveri, I might say that if something that's emerging right now in a very nebulous way comes to life and materializes itself as public notice for, which I am seeing emerge in
Oh,
the
you are.
last 2 or 3 months, which is completely unexpected, you will be the first person I'll call.
Oh, but I'm surprised you say it's unexpected. I would have thought that it's so expected because your relationship with words and with text is so deep. And I wonder where it comes from, Jitish. Were you a big reader when you were growing up, or how did this very deep relationship develop? Because your words are almost like tactile objects. No, sometimes they're made of bone, sometimes they're made of flame in a way, sometimes they're made of bulbs. They're not just words.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a while to think about what was happening with those public notices. Like, it's only when Yale published a book on Public Notice 3, and that kind of forced a reflection on all of the earlier public notices for me to kind of think through that, oh, yeah, they've become a trilogy, and what was I doing? And
Yeah,
it seemed more and more like I was being clerk, being clerical, kind of reciting and revisiting with every error in transmission, in transcription from a time gone by, and materializing them in a form where a human body can move through them. And in each moment, they almost a bit like concrete poetry. They take certain structure vis-a-vis a human body, and in a way they begin to become imagery. So if they became almost signal like with the light bulbs in
mm,
Public Notice 3, they were relic fossil in Public Notice 2, or almost like a charred cremated alphabet in the first Public Notice.
right.
And really, it's, I think, a combination of multiple things, really, Kaveri. I think it's really what those words hold, and how the world outside kind of forces those words to have meaning for yourself first. And sometimes, they hold meaning for you for a while until there's a way in which they can materialize in a way that can speak to anyone else with their bodies, because each of these works are quite physical. You're climbing the steps of the
Yeah,
museum. You're also transitioning. In fact, the grand staircase at the Art Institute is really a nodal point. It's a point where when you go from diagonal left corner to the diagonal right corner, you're moving from a corridor of Japanese
right.
art and culture to European modernism, and crisscross from Middle Eastern art to South Asian art. So I think it's really also something that plays in that museum a certain role in that transition of the body. Yeah, along with all the words and everything it carries. It's yeah.
So, Jitish, how has the lockdown been for you? Has it been a productive period of reflection, period of transformation? What has it been like?
I think it's been a period of reflection for, I think, all of us,
Yeah,
because I think we saw, a kind of an unforeseen world emerge suddenly, and
right.
in periods of weeks. It's almost as if, sometimes there are times in human history where transitions happen in years and decades, and there are other times when transitions happen in weeks. And I think we are not seeing fully what the transitions that have already occurred in the weeks gone by. It's not just that we've stayed home, but the world has transitioned dramatically in the weeks that we have stayed home. And to me, that of course has been, forcing certain reflections about one's own life, about the world. The other thing that's happened is I actually came into quarantine into this particular studio, which is right across from home. It's not my main studio,
Mm.
but but this space has really allowed me to remain in a sort of in a certain creative cycle.
Mm.
There were certain weeks, I must say, there's also this guilt in one's creativity. I think that
Mm.
that one is thinking. I mean, it just felt like, can you think about art right now? Like,
Right.
and I remember a friend saying that's all you should think about right
Yeah.
now or something. She reprimanded me as if
It is
and
true.
it was interesting to hear her say it in those words. But that said, I think like clearly what began with the circadian studies has also extended into other ideas, which I think will take a while, and I would not hurry their
Yeah.
next stages. But a lot has gestated within me at this moment, and I think it's not directly to do with the pandemic or anything of that kind, but it's really the circumstances forcing some sort of long arc reflections, and which hopefully may become something as in times to come.
Wonderful. I think your gallerists must be waiting very eagerly for what's coming next, I'm sure. But thank you so much for joining us, Jitish. It was so lovely to listen to you, to walk through not even, I think, half of your work, but at least, I think, some significant work, which at least I have related to, and I think the world has enjoyed so much. So thank you so much for continuing to be a seismograph, a semionaut, uh, just an artist, whatever we'd like to call you. Thank you so much, Jitish.
Thank you, Kavi. Such a delight. Yeah, thank
Thank
you. Bye.
you. Bye.